Before power was measured in market share, it was measured in territory. Let's review the ultimate strategists. The pressure is immediate, the structure is exposed. The puzzle is not just who prevailed, but if rulers claimed the backing of divine authority, why did that claim sometimes fail to stop a revolt? The pressure is immediate. At first glance, the answer can look personal, as if one stronger figure simply outmaneuvered weaker rivals and the rest of the system followed. The pressure is immediate. That explanation is too thin for the pressure we are studying, because sacred legitimacy may function less as a self-sufficient source of obedience than as one component of rule that still requires other supports. So the promise of this episode is a structural reading of power, legitimacy, and institutional durability, not another heroic summary of events. The pressure is immediate. The structure is exposed. If rulers claimed the backing of divine authority, why did that claim sometimes fail to stop a revolt? That is the tension the institution has to absorb before uncertainty becomes political opportunity. The problem begins when sacred legitimacy can elevate a ruler symbolically while still proving too thin to secure obedience when coalition support, institutions, or material conditions begin failing underneath it. Once that happens, leadership becomes a test of architecture, not charisma, because every layer below the center starts judging what still deserves obedience. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. The relevant distinction is the difference between constructing a sacred claim of legitimacy and making that claim function as a sufficient practical basis of obedience under strain. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and when that distinction is blurred, people often misread a structural weakness as a personal drama and then miss the mechanism actually driving the instability. Everyone starts recalculating. The risk spreads quickly. That is why the stakes are broader than one ruler, one faction, or one disputed decision. Everyone starts recalculating. The risk spreads quickly. The structure feels fragile. Everyone starts recalculating. If authority leans too heavily on presence alone, the institution eventually discovers how little of itself it can carry without constant personal intervention. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. The lens here is boundary conditions of legitimacy theory, and the point of that lens is to separate visible command from the quieter structures that make command durable. Boundary conditions of legitimacy theory, how sacred sanction can function as only one component of rule, requiring material, institutional, or coalition support to remain effective under stress. The distinction matters here. In conceptual terms, this mechanism matters because leadership can appear strongest precisely where the institution underneath it is least prepared to function alone. The distinction matters here. The mechanism is becoming clearer. The goal is not to pretend every historical setting is the same. It is to see where the same kind of institutional pressure keeps reappearing under different surfaces. Personal brilliance can dominate the scene, while institutional design determines whether the scene can be repeated after that brilliance weakens, disappears, or changes hands. The distinction matters here. That is why we are not asking whether leaders matter. We are asking what kind of structure their leadership leaves behind for everyone else to inhabit. The distinction matters here. Success in the short run can hide a delayed weakness if the system still depends on habits, permissions, or loyalties that only one person knows how to coordinate. The thesis then is hard to build in practice. Sacred legitimacy may function less as a self-sufficient source of obedience than as one component of rule that requires other supports. The first point is that sacred sanction can be politically powerful without being politically sufficient by itself. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. A ruler may possess an elevated claim, yet obedience still depends on whether institutions, coalitions, and material support continue carrying that claim into everyday practice. That is the mechanism. This is why a sacred title can coexist with deep vulnerability. Symbolic authority may remain high even while practical support is thinning below it. That is the mechanism. The boundary question therefore matters more than the construction question alone. We are asking what sacred legitimacy can still not do without help. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. Sacred claims can strengthen continuity, elevate office, and organize public meaning, especially when they align with working institutions and cooperating elites. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. They become weaker when those other supports deteriorate. because the claim then has to carry burdens it was never designed to carry alone. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. A revolt tests the difference sharply. Under pressure, people reveal whether they still trust the sacred order materially, coalitionally, and institutionally, not only ceremonially. That is the mechanism. This is why sacred legitimacy often looks strongest in ritual moments and most vulnerable when supplies, alliances, offices, or local loyalties begin fragmenting. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. The mechanism is therefore conditional. Sacred sanction amplifies rule better than it replaces all other foundations of rule. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. A ruler who mistakes amplification for sufficiency may invest too heavily in symbolic affirmation while neglecting the institutions and coalitions that let the affirmation hold. That is the mechanism. The failure mode teaches us something important. Revolt does not always prove sacred legitimacy meaningless. It may prove instead that sacred legitimacy was unsupported. That is the mechanism. That is also why comparison matters. In some cases, the sacred claim appears durable because the wider support system remains intact around it. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. In other cases, the same kind of claim collapses quickly because it is asked to compensate for lost resources, alienated elites, or fraying institutions. That is the mechanism. The strategic lesson is not anti-religious and not credulous. It is that legitimacy of this kind works within a larger system of support rather than floating free above it. The question then is not whether sacred legitimacy matters. It is when it matters enough, and when other missing supports make it too thin to stop open challenge. A fair counterpoint is that some revolts may target other grievances so strongly that the sacred claim is not truly being tested in isolation at all. The limits still matter. The limitation is that causal separation is difficult here because sacred belief, political fear, resource stress, and elite rivalry often intensify one another in the same crisis. The limits still matter. The mechanism fails when rulers lean on sacred language as if it can substitute for coalition repair, administrative strength, or material stability that has already been lost. The limits still matter. There is also a bounded exception in moments when sacred legitimacy is embedded so deeply inside working institutions that it can help hold stress longer than outsiders expect. An analytical reading matters here because we can study the political function of sacred legitimacy without judging any faith tradition as true or false. The limits still matter. Even so, the pattern remains useful. Sacred legitimacy tends to hold more effectively when institutions, coalitions, and material support still reinforce the claim beneath its symbolic surface. The limits still matter. Taken together, those boundaries do not erase the mechanism. They stop us from mistaking one useful explanation for a complete and universal theory of power. The limits still matter. So we can now return to the opening question with sharper terms, less mythology, and a clearer view of what the institution was actually carrying. That is the bounded answer. Sacred legitimacy sometimes failed to stop revolt because the claim depended on institutional, coalition, and material supports that had weakened, leaving sacred sanction unable to carry the whole burden of obedience by itself. In that sense, leadership is partly the craft of shaping conditions under which authority can move, persist, and still look usable after the central figure changes. That is the bounded answer. When that design fails, successors inherit titles, offices, or territories without inheriting the machinery that once made them governable. That answer remains qualified, yet it explains more than a personality-based reading. When the design holds, conflict, rivalry, or uncertainty can remain because people still expect the institution to continue tomorrow. That answer remains qualified, yet it explains more than a personality reading. The real measure, then, is not whether a ruler ever looked powerful. It is whether the system learned how to keep functioning when power had to travel through other hands. Strategic effectiveness and moral legitimacy remain separate questions, yet both influence whether authority can endure without immediate collapse, improvisation, or deeper coercion. That is the bounded answer. The explanation still holds. That is the resolution. Durable leadership builds arrangements stronger than presence, while brittle leadership leaves everyone waiting for a person who is no longer enough. That is the bounded answer. Once that becomes visible, the topic stops looking like pageantry and starts looking like a disciplined question about structure, incentives, continuity, and institutional memory. That is the bounded answer. Study the architecture of command by asking what practical supports are carrying a legitimacy claim when pressure rises. Ask the structural question. Look at the institution. Authority moves through institutions, and even elevated sacred authority still has to travel through offices, coalitions, and material life to remain effective. Ask the structural question. Remove the ceremonial surface, and the deeper issue becomes whether sacred legitimacy is being reinforced from below or asked to float unsupported above a weakening structure. This outcome cannot be reduced to belief alone, because belief works politically through systems that can either reinforce or exhaust it. Ask the structural question. Strategic effectiveness is not legitimacy, yet the lesson remains that symbolic authority rarely governs safely in isolation. Ask the structural question. Look at the institution. The practical reframing is to ask which role, routine, office, coalition, expectation, or resource channel is carrying the system when personal certainty begins to fade. The safer historical question is not who seemed most impressive in the moment, but which structure kept functioning when pressure rose and authority had to travel farther. The unresolved dilemma remains whether sacred legitimacy is being reinforced by living institutions and coalition support, or being stretched beyond what it can politically sustain on its own. Keep that question in view the next time a political story turns structure into personality and contingency into myth. The throne changes, the strategy remains. Until next time.